I read The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson for the Cosmere or the the Cosmere of Summer, the Summer of Cosmere, where I'm reading all of the Cosmere books in the published order, including the short stories and graphic novels and all of the extra stuff. And so I'm going to be talking about the connections between the beginning of the Stormlight Archive here, The Way of Kings, and the Mistborn trilogy, Elantris, and Warbreaker. First of all, the structure of this book, just as a story, is different from the other books that we've seen. To begin with, the scale of time is much, much larger than anything else that we've dealt with in the Cosmere so far. So when Elantris starts off, we get a very short kind of prelude or prologue situation where we learn that Elantris used to be this utopia and that the magic of it was destroyed 10 years ago. And then boom, we're into the story. And then in Mistborn, all of the prologues just have to do with a kind of alternate perspective from kind of the main perspective, if you will, of any given novel. So I think we start off the first book with like Kelsier, for example, and he overturns a plantation and kills all of the leaders of the plantation and frees the ska. And then we go into Vin's perspective after that. And so there's not like a big gap of time there, is what I'm saying. So we had like a decade in Elantris, and in Mistborn, everything moves in a kind of linear fashion from that time that Kelsier attacks the plantation, and then we move onward into the future from there. Same thing in Warbreaker. It's just a linear progression from the inciting incidents all the way through to the conclusion of the story. In The Way of Kings, time is constructed very differently. Our experience of time is very different. And I think that we've kind of changed into a different register of storytelling to a certain degree. The Stormlight Archive, to me, feels like the most epic fantasy kind of register that we get in the Cosmere. Mistborn, I think, is fantasy, but it feels much more like kind of adventure fantasy, or it takes elements of epic fantasy and it kind of plays with it, where we have this idea of like, the Lord Ruler as like the Dark One, and we have a group of heroes who have to overturn that person. And in the backstory of the entire thing is that kind of chosen one narrative, that kind of hero of a thousand faces, hero's journey kind of story that so much of epic fantasy is either built on or plays with. There's a big subversion of all of those kind of tropes and a much more almost like superhero kind of feeling to the characters in Mistborn, to me, than we get in the Stormlight Archive, especially in this book. It feels way more traditional epic fantasy, where we're going to get lots of different characters' perspectives. We're going to have a really enormous world to explore and discover. And the stakes are cosmic. For the first time in these books, we hear the word Cosmere, that obviously I've been using for this whole time, but nobody's ever said it yet. We hear the name Adonalsium, maybe for the second time in the series. I think Sazed mentions it briefly at one point in the last Mistborn trilogy book. And then we also get the three realms named, where we have the physical, the cognitive, and the spiritual realms. So we're like really broadening the amount of information, the scope of, what this shared universe is. And I can remember back when I first read these books and I was like starting to have a suspicion, because I'm not chronically online, that they might possibly be connected. Like there's various hints throughout each of them. And I was like, maybe they all take place on the same world, but there's lots of things to kind of contradict that idea. And And so you just had this feeling that maybe the whole thing is like interconnected in some kind of way, even if you weren't online and like finding out through fandom, how all of those connections actually operate. And I think that the reason that we're able to make those connections or have that feeling is almost because it's like inverted triangle almost, right? Like Elantris was much smaller, much more narrow. And then we got this trilogy of fantasy adventure books in Mistborn. And we've been broadening out more and more. Like Warbreaker really plays with all the ideas in both of those worlds and kind of iterates on them and broadens them, I think. And then this book really expands on them in a huge way. And we get like just much, much bigger. So not only are we going back to the kind of tritagonist structure that we had in Elantris, where we have three main characters. We have Kaladin, who I think this is really like his book. He's the main character, if you will, out of these three. We have Shallan, who contrasts with Kaladin's journey so much, where, Kaladin is deprived and poor. He's a slave. Shallan is privileged and lives in this elite world of academic learning, as opposed to like Kaladin's physical struggle to survive. And then we have Dalinar, who's the third tritagonist, and he is right at the apex of the power structure in his kingdom, adjacent to the king of Alethkar, and he is going through that kind of internal struggle that we saw Rathan go through in the Elantris book, where his way of seeing the world, his experiences of his culture and his heritage are all being thrown into question because of these visions that he's having and the consequences of the death of his brother, where he has gone on a journey of reading scripture for the first time in his life now that he's entered his 50s, and he's kind of undergone this conversion that has completely transformed the way that he sees the world. And I think all of the characters actually have a very kind of internal journey in this book. So I don't want to like just limit it to Dalinar, but I do think it has a lot in common with Rathan's journey in Elantris, because there's this overturning of a religious point of view that has to do with an internal feeling of being a kind of hypocrite, that his culture says that he should be behaving in one way, but inside he feels that he should be behaving in a different way, that the big problem with his culture is that it is misaligned in Dalinar's view with the way that people pretend their intentions and actions are directed. So everybody pretends to be honorable, but then their deeper, more core beliefs and actions indicate that they have no honor whatsoever. So everybody will just stab you in the back at the first opportunity. And Dalinar feels like everything should be realigned so that people are honorable again, like they were in the scripture, The Way of Kings, which the book is named after. But the first person who needs to realign themselves, if you will, is Dalinar himself. Like he takes that journey really seriously, in the same way I think that Rathan does at the end of Elantris, where he has to kind of realign himself, and it radically changes, who is his ally and who is his enemy. And the outcomes and the motivations and everything about the characterization is like totally different. So I'm not saying that they're parallel, but that there are these themes and ideas that Sanderson returns to again and again, but through slightly different vectors that give us a kind of kaleidoscopic effect on the same idea when we get to examine it in this way, where we're, looking at it as each book adds on to our understanding of what heroism and villainy are in the Cosmere. because I don't think that there's like a formal villain in the book per se for these characters to fight. There are many kind of hidden antagonists, if you will, but no one in particular is kind of aligned against any of the other characters who are driving the primary action. So I say that there's 3 protagonists in the book, but I'm not including Zeth in there, for example, because I think that Zeth operates in the story as a kind of foil for each of the primary protagonists. So Zeth's story has to do with keeping his word. He's made a promise that he will obey his master no matter what. And then it doesn't matter, his internal feelings about what is right and wrong. Those actions are not his responsibility because he is merely a kind of extension or instrument of his master. And so he has no direct personal responsibility for his actions, but he still suffers this kind of traumatic effects of the murders that he does in the names of his masters. And so this is a particular idea of honor and of keeping your word that directly clashes with the experience of Kaladin, where he has this internal suffering that comes from the loss of people around him, his inability to be potent enough to change the world to be the way that he wants it to be. And the fact that he feels he needs to kill people in order to protect other people. And that he makes these promises to people that he will protect them, and then he fails to protect them over and over and over again. So Zeth successfully keeps his promises. Zeth is potent enough to kill his enemies and change the world around him, but the entire way that is all unfolding is the exact opposite of Kaladin's experience. And you contrast that again with Dalinar and the way that he wants to, realign the culture of Alethkar and ensure that going forward, the kingdom has a very particular way of being honorable that has to do with a kind of integrity or alignment between how people feel on the inside versus how they behave on the outside. That's the exact opposite of what Zeth is doing, that Zeth finds honor in suppressing his internal feelings and merely executing the actions of another person, that he bears no responsibility. In other words, that the ultimate virtue for Zeth is obedience. I think throughout the book, Dalinar tries to achieve a kind of obedience to the code of conduct that's outlined in the Way of Kings, but he fails again and again in his larger goal to change the culture of Alethkar because he doesn't understand the deeper responsibility that he has to take to not merely be a example for other people to follow, but to use force to require people to internalize those values and really go along with them. And a similar thing for Shallan when it comes to Zeth as well, where she's totally misrepresented herself in her relationship to Yasna and the rest of the wider culture. In fact, she's lying to everyone all the time. She's spying on people. She's giving her word that, yes, this is who I am, but she has no integrity as far as that goes. And so she has these internal desires that she is keeping true to, but she's totally misrepresenting with her external actions that are read by everyone around her what those internal desires are. So she seems to be a person who just wants to gain social rank and to expand her knowledge and be a scholar. but in fact, she is a thief and a spy, basically. And so she's the exact opposite of Zeth, that she is prioritizing her interior goals and motives and desires and attaching herself to a master who she constantly disobeys and thwarts. And so while I think that later on we'll get more of Zeth's journey and he will have more of a protagonist role maybe in other Stormlight Archive books, I don't include him as a protagonist in this book because he's not driving the action. And in fact, that's how his character is calibrated. He is merely an instrument of other characters who drive the action. And symbolically, in the structure of the story, he operates as a foil for the main characters in their relationship to honor. But to get back to this idea of time and how it's fundamentally different than the other Cosmere books that we've had, we start off very, very early in the history of this world. We find out at the end of the prologue that it says 3,000 years later, right? We're like, whoa, what a huge amount of time. We haven't had anything that's like that at all. And then even when we get the story of the death of King Gavilar, which is, the important inciting incident in a lot of ways to the whole story, we jump ahead a whole nother set of years. And so we're moving through time very rapidly there, right at the beginning of the book. And as we move through the book, we're going to be overlapping the events from the perspectives of each of the characters in the familiar way that we did also in Elantris. But when we're in the perspective of Kaladin, who is kind of, like I said, the main character in this book, if you will, we get a lot of flashbacks from him, which is not something that we've done before in the Cosmere. So we've had characters tell other characters about their past, or we've had, we're in the head of a character and they remember things in a particular moment that, they're reminded of this and that when things are happening, but it's not a full-on kind of we're transported to a different version of this character from a previous time element in the story the way that it's happening here. So we get entire chapters that are from the perspective of Kaladin in his childhood and in his teenage years that fill in the gaps that have to do, from his upbringing in a small town to how did he get here in a slave cage at the beginning of the story where we meet him. And even when we actually get into the story proper, if you will, we're jumping from perspective to perspective of other characters who are not our main characters. And so when we start off the story, it kind of starts in the past before that whole situation of Kaladin being a slave. We get to see Kaladin through the eyes of the character Sen, who I've always felt like Sen is a reference to the Wheel of Time, by the way. There's that character Sen Bui in the Wheel of Time, who is a personal favorite character of mine, the grumpy old man. But of course, Brandon Sanderson helped to finish the Wheel of Time after the passing of Robert Jordan. And I've always felt like Sen is a little nod, a tip of the hat to that whole thing. But anyway, Sen is a perspective character that we see Kaladin for the first time through his eyes. And I think that helps to frame Kaladin as a heroic person in the story for us, that we kind of see the way that Kaladin breaks into the war and changes the battlefield with his unique way to command his squad, the heroic way that he saves his soldiers, and the just complete badass way that he is as a fighter. We get to see all that through someone else's eyes instead of going inside of Kaladin's perspective in that part of the battle and getting all of the vulnerabilities and the chewy emotional journey. We get to experience him as kind of the heroic character before we get the soft underbelly of his perspective and really meet him as maybe his lowest point in his life, where he's been captured, he's been branded, and he's a slave. So even when the story kind of quote unquote starts, it begins in this mode of the past, which we're going to return to that battle again and again and again throughout the series, even, but especially in this book. And so all of that to say that time is being used very differently in the Stormlight Archive than the rest of the Cosmere books that we've seen on a structural level for how we are telling the story. But I think that time is being introduced here in a formal way in the book because going forward through the Cosmere, time is going to become an important element, not only in this kind of formal storytelling way, but functionally within the actual universe itself. Time will become an important element of the actual way that characters interact with each other. And we'll see more of that when we get to the following book that was published after this that goes back to the Mistborn world. So enough about time. We're going to try to break the story down according to the journey of each of the three main characters. And I'll start off with Kaladin. And so I made this claim that there's no antagonists in the story, that the conflict is kind of an internal conflict for all three of these characters. And immediately, like, my mind goes to like, okay, well, what about, Tavlakov, who we start off with, or Kaladin's father, or Sadeas, or Gaz, or Lamoral, and, on and on like that. And I think what you can see in that parade of antagonists there is that there is no one single antagonist. I mean, I think the closest you could come, right, is to say that Sadeas is kind of the antagonist for both Dalinar and Kaladin. And I guess that's true on a certain level, but that's not who Kaladin is trying to overcome or defeat. The person who he needs to overcome is himself. And that begins in that, place where he starts out as a slave. So when we first get into Kaladin's POV, he's being transported across the desert in kind of no man's land where there is no law. And he's going to be sold. He's already been sold into slavery, and he's going to be sold off eventually to Sadeas. And the problem here isn't that he's a slave, because we find out that he's been a slave in the past and he's resisted his captivity. He's tried to lead slave revolts. He's tried to get away. He's tried to tell his story to people to get justice. And none of that has worked. And instead, the problem here is that Kaladin has given up. He's kind of become what he calls the wretch. And so if we compare this to the beginning of Elantris with Raoden, he becomes cursed as an Elantrian and thrown into the cursed city of Elantris that's full of violence and all of these bizarre rules. And the thing that he does not do in that story, nor does he ever do, is give up. He never just assumes that, that things can't get better. And if you compare Raoden, I'm laughing. I love Kaladin. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying anything bad about Kaladin. I love him so much. But if you compare Raoden and Kaladin, Kaladin has this idea that he has been cursed. And Raoden has literally been cursed, it feels like, but he doesn't see it as a curse. He sees it as a blessing. And so that's why I say that Raoden is that kind of archetype of heroism in the Cosmere, that belief that there is always an answer to every problem. There's always a way to solve things is the very soul of heroism in the Cosmere, I think. And Kaladin is starting at exactly the opposite place from that, because he is going to go on an arc. He is going to go on a journey, right? Because that's right there in the creed of the Knights Radiant, journey before destination. And so the journey is so, so, so important to this story. For Raoden, he starts at the destination and he kind of pulls other people in with the gravity of his point of view. That's his leadership style. That's how his story works. Kaladin is a completely different kind of character who really needs to go on an arc. And we've seen Sanderson send his characters on arcs through the Mistborn trilogy. Vin had an arc all the way across the 3 books that's really beautiful. And even in Warbreaker, we see characters like Lightsong go through a really interesting inversion of where they start compared to where they end. And of course, Vivenna and, like all of those characters really like turn upside down by the end of that story. And so the main antagonist for Kaladin, I would think, is the Wretch. It is that person that he sees himself as who has no hope. And right away, we find out that he has this invisible companion with him in Syl. And Syl is a Windspren who has attached herself to Kaladin, and she is mischievous and bubbly and kind of naive in ways that balance out the darkness inside of Kaladin and give him someone to have an alternate perspective on and a constant companion to him. And when we compare this to the other books, there's a supernatural influence that Syl has on Kaladin. There's a partnership here that's really, really important. And the closest thing that we've ever seen to this, really, I think, is in the Mistborn trilogy, the way that Vin is constantly being whispered to by Ruin. And the other characters, finally, in the 3rd book, are being influenced by Ruin as well. And so the supernatural influences that we've seen on characters so far in the Cosmere have had a negative influence or a kind of evil influence on them. And this takes that similar idea to that and I think flips it on its head. And so all of the negativity is kind of contained in the persona of the Wretch for Kaladin. And then that is being pulled on or deconstructed by Syl's positive, supernatural, spiritual influence. So in the Cosmere, these supernatural forces that exist in the universe are not merely negative, is the thing that we're learning in this book. And Kaladin gets sold to Sadeas, to the Sadeas camp, and then made into a bridgeman, which is just like hell on earth. It seems like the very worst thing that could happen to a person. And he has to do that first bridge run with no shoes and no vest. He has like no protection for his body, and he's completely brutalized. That first run is just so terrible. It reminds me of when they go into Elantris for the first time, and some of those poor people are abused in such a way that their body is like utterly broken, and there's nothing, like they can't die from that, and they are just like stuck in that state forever. That's how it feels to me. Like that's the first thing that it reminds me of, is like, welcome to being a bridgeman. And it's just like the worst thing ever. And it breaks Kaladin. He gives up. He goes to the chasm to throw himself in and commit suicide. And they call the chasm the honor chasm. And honor comes up over and over and over again. And by the end of the book, we learn that there is a person named Honor who is worshipped as the almighty god of the Vorin religion, and that he is dead. And so, that whole thing, I think is really significant that it's called the honor chasm, that to kill yourself is considered honorable. And like, think back to Warbreaker and what was the virtue of the returned gods of Halandren was to sacrifice your life to provide a miracle for the institution of the religion, right? That you do these miracles, and that's why the people believe, that's why they sacrifice, that's why they give to the religion. And we saw gods who died in the Mistborn series as well. In the, Ruin died and Preservation died. So there's this theme of, the idea that there are gods in the universe, but those gods have some kind of weird mortality. They're not eternal gods. They're not all powerful. They're not all knowing. They can be destroyed in some way. And so the thing that, there's a contention on the cosmic level that's happening right away in this story, that there's a struggle between life and death. And I think for Kaladin, and we've seen this too with Kelsier, right? And with Vin, the idea of survival in the face of enormous trauma, the survival itself is a virtue, right? And so to pull back from the honor chasm and not throw yourself in, it's harder to choose life than to give in to death. And various characters throughout this book say that. And that's another part of the creed of the Knights Radiant, life before death. So it's core to the themes of the book, but I think it's linked up with the rest of the Cosmere. Like, we can kind of see the way in which these virtues extend out to people like Kelsier and Vin, and are really like an entire religion in the Mistborn world, right? With the people who worship the survivor. Kaladin survives this encounter with the honor chasm, and he decides that, what's the worst that can happen? Like, he literally, the worst has happened. He's a bridgeman. How much worse could it possibly get? And so he will try again. He will try to make a place for these bridgemen to have a genuine, authentic human experience, community where they can fully become themselves. And that is the kind of project that we saw Raoden do in Elantris. And that is the same kind of project that we saw Kelsier do in the first Mistborn book. Those guys were, part of a heist crew, whatever, and they're there to do a job. But at the same time, whenever they encountered their failures, what does Kelsier do? He smiles, even though he feels that despair, even though he has that doubt. He smiles in the face of that, and he keeps on adapting the plan and never gives up. There's always an answer. There's always another mystery to solve, right? And so that's the same kind of attitude that Kaladin moves into in this phase of the story. He's going to solve the problem of hopelessness in himself, but also the community of the Bridgemen that he's a part of, Bridge 4. And then really the rest of the story is the working out of that whole thing. And we also delve into the backstory of Kaladin, and we see that his depression has roots that predate, this terrible circumstance of his captivity and enslavement. In some ways, even in his childhood, he has struggled with depression. It seems like he has a kind of clinical depression that Sanderson is depicting. And then that is complicated by a PTSD that he experiences when he goes through the death of his younger brother and then the subsequent death of his squad. But even when he's training to be a surgeon with his father and he loses the various patients who come in for help at their clinic, and they die from their wounds, he takes that very personally. He takes a lot of responsibility for that. And I think there's an element of like a subconscious desire on Kaladin's part that I think he wants someone in the world to kind of take responsibility for that part of himself that he is contending with. He wants somebody to step in and kind of deal with the wretch for him. And that, I think, is what unconsciously motivates this savior complex that he has, where he's constantly trying to step in for everybody else's inadequacies. He wants to save everyone from whatever the problems are in their life because he just wants somebody to save him from this depression that he has. And his younger brother Tien kind of did that for him before he was killed in the war. He was one of the people who could reach through the darkness for Kaladin and bring him back to himself. But then he feels like he failed to reciprocate that for Tien, and he can't bear the weight of that failure. And now there's also no one there to catch Kaladin when he falls, if you will. And so I think, kind of stepping into that gap and interceding, we get Syl. That is where Syl comes into Kaladin's life. Is, she's that supernatural companion who will always be there for him and encouraging him to turn away from the wretch and to believe in himself, but also to have those more healthy boundaries where he doesn't try to carry the load that is not his load. And even though we have all of these different kind of antagonistic relationships in Kaladin's story, between Kaladin and his father, Kaladin and Gazg, and then the various Light Eyes who are in charge of his bridge crew, it's the working out of that confrontation with the wretch. And that is the central conflict. And it's kind of re-expressed when Kaladin is put up in the high storm and allowed to kind of quote unquote die. So in one sense, like symbolically, Kaladin dies when he goes to the honor chasm, because he even tells Gaz this, that he comes back and he's like, that guy that you met is dead. And now I'm here. And so in his mind, he kind of killed the wretch. And now, he's a different person. He's kind of like decided to remake himself. But after the high storm, that is like an experience of death that he goes through. And then a kind of miraculous resurrection almost that has to do with, the magical system in the story. So it literally is miraculous or magical that Kaladin is able to survive this ordeal. There's no way that it could have happened otherwise. And then again and again, Kaladin does the impossible and manages to protect the people that would otherwise, it would be out of his reach to protect. And every time that he does that, it's because he's actively choosing to not turn back to that darkness and to not surrender to death. Like during the high storm, we literally see Syl fighting off death spren that are coming for him. And he says to the other bridgemen that I will come back, come get me when the high storm is done because I won't be dead. And then he tells Syl that he's willing to be a miracle for them. And so he's choosing hope. He's choosing the project of community. He's choosing his place in this society. And he's not surrendering to these feelings that he has inside of worthlessness and despair. And at the end of the story, all of that effort is rewarded by an inversion of the other major problem that Kaladin has in his character, which mirrors the story in Warbreaker to a degree, I think, where I talked about the kind of bigotry that Ciri and Vivenna were raised with for Halandrin, and the hatred that they felt, and the hatred that Kelsier had for the nobility in Mistborn, and the hatred that Delof had for the Elantrians in that story. Kaladin has this deep hatred for the Light Eyes and for their hypocrisy, for their two-facedness, and he doesn't trust that any of them will ever live up to the words that they say. And so he comes to a point in the story where he trusts Dalinar and he trusts in his word, and he's rewarded for that trust. And a new kind of community is able to be built because Kaladin takes that leap. And I think that his hatred and the wretch are kind of linked together in that way, that Kaladin actively chose not to give in to the hatred that he still feels. It's still there. He has to contend with it, but he can choose to turn away from it. And when he did, the story rewarded him for that. And he won his freedom, and he won freedom for all the people that he's been trying to protect. And so that's why I say there's like no real antagonist that Kaladin needs to defeat in this story that kind of like symbolically wraps up his journey in a single kind of persona. And then, like he battles with them and wins. And then that shows the way in which he wins, in his internal conflict at the same time. The story is just not constructed that way. I think it's a internal conflict, and the sense of like catharsis in the story, the really incredibly good feeling of the ending comes from the relief that the rug is not going to be pulled out from Kaladin this time. Like, we've seen it happen over and over and over. And it's so heartbreaking every time. And then at the end, it doesn't happen. Like, it feels like, oh my God, it's going to happen again. And Dalinar's not going to keep his promise, and they're going to go back to Sadeas, and he's going to lose everybody somehow one more time. And it doesn't happen. And it's such a relief. It feels so good. And so the other contrasting story to that, we have Kaladin and, as a slave. And then we have Shallan as this privileged, rich woman who gets to apprentice herself to the greatest academic in the world, Yasna, and, spends all of her time in a palace hanging out with priests and learning about, philosophy and history. So, like, basically, if you ask me, the dream, right? Like, Shallan is living the dream. And you could say that, like, Shallan's antagonist in the story is Yasna, because she wants to steal Yasna's soulcaster and then use it to restore her family to the rank that they had. Like, they're deeply in debt and they need money, and this is going to help them get money. And so Yasna has the kind of MacGuffin that Shallan needs, and so that is her antagonist, and she needs to get the MacGuffin from the antagonist and blah, 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 blah. But I don't really think that works when you look at Shallan's larger story. Superficially, I think that makes the scenario like have a lot of energy, that when we find out that Shallan is there to actually betray Yasna and that she's going to steal from her. And especially once we meet Yasna and see how formidable she is, she's intellectually extremely powerful. She's very, very rich, and she's connected to the Alethi kingdom that is extremely powerful. And so, as in terms of like, all the people that you could have picked to rob in the world, why would you pick this very dangerous person? So that is a pretty fun scenario to read a story about. Like, that's a great setup for a story. And those lines of conflict seem very straightforward, but the thing is that Shallan does not really understand her own motivations, and she's not deeply in touch with who she is. In fact, she has many layers of like ironic distance from herself. She's constantly avoiding thinking about different things. Like I talked about the relationship that this book has with time and how we jump into these flashbacks with Kaladin. Whenever we get close to flashbacks with Shallan, she backs off mentally. She retreats psychically from those things. And so Shallan's real conflict is merely to face herself at all in the story. Like Kaladin is constantly kind of confronting the wretch and turning away from him and actively trying to build a healthy community and on like that. And so he's very much in touch with this part of himself that he rejects. Shallan is using all of her energy to avoid encountering herself in that same way. It's very much the opposite of what Kaladin is doing, I think. And a lot of this entire thing of like robbing Yasna and learning all of these things are a distraction from having to encounter herself. All of these outer projects, if you will, are a defense mechanism against having to look at herself and admit to herself like what she has done in her past and what that makes her right now. And so that's why earlier I said that she doesn't have any integrity. It's not that I don't like Shallan. Like, Shallan might actually be my favorite Stormlight character, or the one that I feel the closest to in a lot of ways. But don't worry, like, both of my parents live. I haven't killed them or anything. I just feel very much that, like, I sabotage relationships with people a lot of times, and I sabotage myself a lot, and I am so reluctant to encounter myself in so many ways and constantly distract myself with all of these projects, like doing a podcast, for example. So I get it, what's going on with Shallan, I think. I really, really feel that energy that she has. And it takes the entire story for her to admit a truth. And she's not even admitting it to herself. She's admitting it, to the Spren, that she killed her father. And so we knew at the beginning of the story that her father was dead and that this was a secret that she had to keep from everybody else to protect her house from being attacked or disbanded. But we didn't know that she was actually the murderer. And we don't know any context about that at all. Like, we just find out that fact, and then that is like the closure of her story. And it feels like in so many ways throughout her story that she's naive and that she is powerless, that she, like, she gets into this confrontation over buying some books and she's just going to get absolutely robbed by this bookseller. And then she, hilariously gets bailed out by her sailor friend. But that just seems like a scenario where Shallan is not very capable as a negotiator. She can't stand up for herself. She's, she just doesn't understand how to even do basic shopping in the world. That's not the kind of person that you would expect is so dangerous that she killed her father, right? And that she then decided, I'm going to rob the most capable person on the planet. And then she successfully does it. And so there's ways in which Shallan's capabilities are hidden from us as the reader, and that we encounter them and we're like, whoa, where is this coming from, right? And it's because in the formal sense of like how the book is constructed, it's mirroring that psychic distance that Shallan is having from herself. We are experiencing Shallan in the same way that she experiences herself, which is to say, she doesn't experience herself, right? This very fractured, deeply fractured. And just the beginning of starting to bridge that fracture is the total arc of her story in this book. And I think that's set up to be, connected to Kaladin's story, but also kind of contrasting and sort of the opposite to it. And there's something there too about like male and female. They're both on this journey of like they're emerging into magical powers that they don't really understand. And so they feel very connected to me, but in opposite ways. So like very balanced out. There's something about like the energy that Vin and Elend have in the Mistborn books that is kind of similar to me, where Elend is like has no powers but is highly political, and Vin has all of these magical abilities but is like no good at dealing with people. She's so blunt and direct. And they literally end up dressing like in black and white and have this kind of yin yang energy. It feels that same way to me in this book with Kaladin and Shallan, even though they don't ever encounter each other. And then Dalinar is the third tritagonist in the book. And his story, again, it feels like you could say he has an antagonist in Sadeas, but also has an antagonist in the king, and he has an antagonist in every other high prince, or even Navani is a kind of antagonist to him because she's forcing him to encounter his feelings of desire, the ways in which he feels like he's a hypocrite because he wants to be with her even though he's not allowed to, and then he gives into that and feels like he's betrayed himself, that he's destroyed his sense of honor in some way. There's all of these boundaries that Dalinar has constructed in himself, and all of this guilt around those boundaries. And it seems to come from this fundamental failure to save his brother, who is assassinated at the beginning of the story. And I think that links him in a way with Kaladin and the way that he feels like, he failed to save his brother as well, right? And that so much of his grief and pain and the remaking of who he is emanates out of that. But there's an inversion of the direction of those things, because when Dalinar talks about how he was before Gavilar died, he was the most savage warrior in the world. He was the Blackthorn. He was feared by everyone, both his enemies and his allies. And Kaladin only becomes a formidable warrior after the death of his brother. He kind of does it as like, I should have been this good all along. And if I can save people with this martial prowess, that is what I will do. And Dalinar only starts to confront who he was as the Blackthorn after Gavilar's death. And so his life project after that is to become a different kind of man, maybe who would have been there for his brother. So that's a similarity between him and Kaladin, but it's in a completely different way. It's in a way where his energies are no longer unrestrained and allowed to, he's not going out there and getting drunk and then going to battle and being your berserker who kind of splashes in the blood of his enemies with glee. Instead, he's like a extremely controlled person now, or that's what he is straining to be. And so all of the energy in the story is really about breaking those boundaries that he's put up for himself, because there's ways in which they are inappropriate for who Dalinar truly is. And that he needs to kind of accept himself. Like all of this constructed boundaries and channeling of energy is really a rejection of who he was. And it seems like he so thoroughly rejected himself that he even forgot who his wife was in the past, because of a magical curse. That feels like symbolically, like he really lost a part of himself in a deep way to this project of remaking himself. And so I think there's a way in which like Kaladin's journey of remaking himself is a really positive journey that the story endorses and says this is good. But Dalinar's remaking of himself is much more fraught. It's much more difficult for him because his entire culture rejects him as he, has aligned himself with honorable behavior, and everybody's like, wow, what a stupid thing to do. You can't be this blunt politically because it just makes you a huge target. And it also makes him just seem like a dummy to them, that like, why would you do the harder thing when you could do the easier thing? Why would you choose to not get glory and riches on the battlefield and instead, spend all of your resources protecting the camp and protecting the king and on like that? And that's because, it gets back to that theme that's in the creed of the Knights Radiant: strength before weakness. All of these other high princes are choosing the shortcut, the easier path, the weakness, and Dalinar turns away from that and chooses strength over and over. But the cost of that strength is not merely the rejection of his people or the misunderstanding of his king in who he is and what he intends, but also these visions that are coming over Dalinar and like absorbing him during the high storms. You talked about the positive influence that Syl has over Kaladin, and the way in which that kind of feels like that relationship that Vin and Ruin had with each other, but kind of inverted into something good. This is something else yet again. Like it's an entirely different way of, communication. It seems like, God is talking directly to Dalinar. It feels like a kind of, like Moses in the Bible or something, right? Like he's getting these very profound, incredible, all-encompassing visions of the past. And then God directly speaks to him and he takes it seriously and has a lot of sincerity towards that entire experience. But that really challenges his project of remaking himself, because it seems like God is making demands of him that are even beyond the demands that he is making on himself. And at the end of the story, I think what it kind of shakes out as is that God fails to live up to Dalinar's standards, that even Dalinar can't live up to his standards, but neither can God. Like God fails Dalinar, and he admits to Dalinar, actually, I was dead all along, and I don't even know if you're going to be able to survive what's coming next. But you need to try. You need to try to remake yourselves, and here is the creed that will help you do it. And so through all of these books, like I talked about, there's this idea that, people are innately good, or that they want to reach for the goodness that is inside of them. But that if we are out there as individuals, if we are cut off from the rest of community, we can't actually be our best selves. We need the community to raise us up, because we all have weaknesses. There's all ways that these characters are inadequate, and that the community helps to bolster them and pull them together and make them whole. I think you can really see that in the found family story of Kaladin in this book, and the community that he constructs, and the way in which not only Kaladin lifts them up, but they in turn lift him up. At those times when he's feeling hopeless and he, can't bear the wretch anymore, those people are there for him. Dalinar is far more alone, I think, than Kaladin is in his story. He has his sons, his family, but just as often Adolin is fighting with him and Renarin doesn't know what to do for his father. then they are there to help reassure him that he's doing the right thing and that his project is a good idea. And Navani has her own needs from Dalinar that have nothing to do with his project. And so she doesn't have the energy to stand in for him and kind of lift him up in that way that's happening for Kaladin in his story. And so he's far more isolated. And I think because of that, we can see the way in which Dalinar is at a really low point in his life, that he struggles. As much as Kaladin struggles, he manages to build a community and evolve more than Shallan and Dalinar. And I think that has to do with the way in which those two characters are so isolated as compared to Kaladin. There's a message in the story about the power of community and the necessity of community when it comes to becoming a different person in changing. And so like I don't know, like I could keep going on and on about like the magic system. I haven't touched it all, and like the larger implications for the Cosmere. I haven't talked about wit. I haven't talked about, the implications of like slavery in this story, the huge theme of slavery. There's just so much to the Way of Kings. It's such a huge classic book that really like requires far more digging in than I could do in this podcast. But the off the top of my head, the thoughts that I was having during this read through really centered in on those internal conflicts with these characters, the journey that they're on, and the way that resonates with the other Cosmere books that I've read so far. So that's kind of what I laid out here. It's not everything that I think is in this book or like my definitive analysis of the Way of Kings, if that is even a thing that is possible. But it's as much as I feel like I can talk about it right now. And so I'm going to move on to the next book, The Alloy of Law, in the second Mistborn era. And that'll be the next book in the Summer of Cosmere.